Hello, I hope you're doing well. We're going to try this one once again. This is food webs, and I'm dressed intelligently, as I hope you are, as you can see, and I hope you're doing well there at home. This one's about different kinds of members of a community interacting with each other, like wolves and deer. So it's interspecific interactions, and here's a couple of neat videos. This one's especially neat. It might gross you out a little bit, but it's pretty cool if you want to watch. We are going to have a little bit of vocab here, most of which you're familiar with, right? Herbivores eat plants, parasites, one thing eats another one. And so you have these different relationships. This one's pretty neat too if you want to tune in and watch. You have these relationships that's basically the basis of this set of videos. We have these different interactions, some of which fall into the symbiosis category as well, but not all, like this one. Competition, for instance. A cow and a sheep are trying to eat the same grass, and they're both losing. That's why it says negative, negative from that. Mutualism means they're both gaining. That might be a real close relationship, or it might not be. If it's real close, we would also call it symbiosis. So here you have commensalism is when one doesn't look like it's being affected, although that's hard to judge. And here's one that's definitely pretty close relationship. Ah! And there's that one. That is also overlap with evolutionary stuff, which always happens. We have this niche idea, and we have this competition for parts of a niche. Here we have a very clear and very classic example in ecology. You have these blue kinds of creatures that live on the rocks and these brown kind of creatures. And these different arrows in these names, probably you can figure out what they mean. This means where they could live, their fundamental niche, and this means where they do live. So you can see that since the brown ones could live down here, but they don't, they only live up here, it looks like the blue ones are outcompeting the brown ones. That's the conclusion to come to from that kind of little graph. So now we're to food webs, okay? Troph is a word that means food. And what we're talking here traditionally is how food energy goes from one kind of organism to another. We've been talking all year about what happens to your lunch, right? Part of your lunch gives you energy. How's it do that? It gets broken down in those respiration reactions to recharge ATPs. But then part of it also becomes you, like the part that are protein synthesis to make proteins that'll come you. But our conventional food chain, food web, is following the path of chemical energy. So here's an example of what would be called a food chain, right? In that it's just one after the other without any branches and webbing. And it's a simple idea. The arrows here represent that this thing gets eaten by that thing, therefore passing its molecules onto that thing. And the ones we're focusing on are the molecules that that thing is going to use for energy. So we have these terms. This is a primary producer. It's producing organic molecules from inorganic ones. This is the first thing, primary, to eat those producers. Therefore, primary consumer. If you eat one of those, you're a secondary consumer, and so on and so forth. This guy is like the father of ecology. He first figured out the reason, which we'll come to later, why these food chains are usually only 3 or 4 or 5 links long, why they're not 50 links long. So here's some creatures in the ocean. We kind of focus on ocean things, and we look for producers and consumers, and you're familiar with some of these things and maybe not so much with others. But you see a couple things here which you should be able to recognize as producers. Seaweed for sure, photosynthesizers. These things are the floating kind of things that are plant-like. Most of them are algae, as are most seaweed. These in this little diorama here are the two things that would be the producers that everything else is feeding off of, so to speak, primarily or secondarily. So here you have your typical food web. Again, this is an aquatic kind of one. I can't figure out how to move my face off of this at the moment, so I'm just going to leave it there. I'm sure you can figure that out. Maybe if I touch that button, there we go. But kind of, there you go. So here you see the phytoplankton. They're the only producers in here. How do you figure out that? If these are labeled A, B, C, D, like maybe in a test question, The producers are the only ones that have arrows coming only from them. That means they're not eating anything, right? They're only being eaten. And if you look all around at these things, the only ones that fit that description of where the arrows are the phytoplankton. So now, we often call these the base of the food chain, right? But they don't have to be at the bottom of a diagram. Notice, you could tilt this diagram sideways or upside down and it would still tell the same story. This gets eaten by that, gets eaten by that. So here we have whatever eats those are, again, primary consumers. In this case, that's two things. There's two arrows coming from them. These two are primary consumers. But also notice, this guy is also a secondary consumer because it eats this guy. So primary, secondary. So all these vocab words really are kind of just ways we try to describe certain kind of things, right? So you can get some questions that become pretty complicated and difficult, like what would happen, for instance, if for some reason, maybe disease, lots of squid died off. Maybe all the squid died off. What would happen? Well, now you just follow the arrows. The things that were eating squid, right? You'd maybe predict that their numbers would go down. They have less food, right? Except that they also eat other things. So maybe they'll just compensate by eating more of those other things. What kind of things eat the squid? These kind of things eat the squid, these kind of things. So therefore, you'd predict their numbers might go down too, right? But these kind of things, several of them also eat a whole bunch of other things. This is why it gets complicated. So for instance, if these things only eat squid, this is what this shows, right? Then you definitely predict that their numbers would go down. And therefore, you'd predict that anything that eats them will go down. So this is like dominoes. And putting these together is not too difficult, I don't think, from a perspective of answering test questions about them, which we'll practice on later. So here we are back again. Sometimes certain species in a food web have a higher impact on that food web. We often call them keystone species. And here is a classic example. I'll get out of the way again. Here we have Pisaster. Aster means star. These are starfish. You can see them here. And what this guy did that did this study is he went along the coast in Washington. This is Washington State. And he plucked all the starfish off of this one area. And then he sat back and waited to see what would happen in terms of number of species present. We would call this species diversity. So with these starfish around, this graph says that there were about, 17 different species of things. But when they took the starfish away, in the matter of a couple years down here, right, the number of species present plummeted to about 2 by just taking one species away. This is a classic keystone species kind of thing, and this guy produced that name, Keystone species. So this would show that some types of things in a food web have an inordinate impact on the food web itself. And so here you have a very simple example of the same kind of thing. These three graphs show the number of different individuals in these three kind of groups of anemones and plant-like algae and these otters, and they eat the anemones, and the killer whales eat the otters. What happens if you take the killer whales away? Well, the otter numbers go way up, as you would figure. If the killer whales are back, the otter numbers stay low. What happens when the otter numbers go way up? The things they eat go way down. These are all pretty logical conclusions, but these are the kind of questions that tests like, and even though you're not taking the EOC test, this is a classic kind of EOC test thing. So here's a couple questions to show you how complicated this might be. These aren't the best questions, but they're good for practice. We have a food web here. Which of the following would be a long-term effect, that's key, of removing baleen whales? I wish I had my glasses on. I think those are baleen whales. If we took them away, right, from the ecosystem represented by this food web, well, let's see. These baleen whales get eaten by these guys, so you might expect their numbers to go down. right? B says that their numbers will increase. So that makes that one pretty easily logically wrong. Okay, but let's see, these baleen whales, the krill population. The krill get eaten by baleen whales. Baleen whales are gone, the krill population would increase. That's a likely possibility, right? Except for this fact, right? These things also eat krill, and now their numbers are going to increase because the whales that eat them aren't around anymore. So if their numbers increase, they might eat more krill. This is what makes these questions a little hard to answer. Also, you could justify pretty well several different kinds of answers. The phytoplankton population would increase. The phytoplankton population is probably not going to be the right answer because of this. Or I'm sorry, it may well be the answer because of this long-term effect. Because they're 2 links away, or maybe 3 links away, or 4 in the chain, the phytoplankton population would probably be affected later. Okay, so would it possibly increase? I would say doubtful, because you're taking away something that is eating things that eat the phytoplankton. Um, and so, I'm sorry, you're increasing the amount of those that eat the phytoplankton. I don't think they would increase. And so the large fish and squid population would increase. That would be likely because you have provided some more food for them by taking away thing that eats the krill. That's probably your most likely answer, although I could make a case for A. So here's another one pretty similar. Suppose the lemming population is removed. That's here, which is a short-term effect. So now you're looking just one arrow away, right? And you just pretty logically match up. Okay, if lemmings are eating grasses, then grasses should increase, but grasses aren't part of your answer choices. So let's go to a different one. Lemmings get eaten by Arctic foxes. We don't have any lemmings. Arctic fox will not increase. You would predict them to decrease. Um, Whatever that is, the snowy owl right there, their population, well, there you go. They should decrease if you've taken away some of their food. That one's a little easier to answer. Short term and decrease, those are both the right variables. So here we have another one, which are secondary consumers. This is much more definitively easy to answer, right? So uh, these two things are primary consumers. They eat the producers, right? These are the producers. They have arrows coming only from them, right? This one, however, also eats one of the primary consumers. So that makes it a secondary consumer. So these 3 things which eat this primary consumer, that also makes them secondary consumers. So all 4 of those would be secondary consumers.